Somebody left a comment on this channel a few weeks ago. One like, one reply. Nobody answered it. He had been watching a video about a British undercover unit operating in South Armagh, and he asked what is, when you think about it, the obvious question. How did the IRA not hear the accents? Because that is the thing nobody explains. South Armagh in the 1970s and 1980s was a place where everyone knew everyone. Families had farmed the same townlands for 200 years. Toby Harnden, who spent years researching the area for his book Bandit Country, describes it as roughly 192 square miles, home to around 23,000 people. A landscape where dense kinship networks and what he calls a powerful sense of rebellion throughout history had combined to make it one of the most hostile operating environments anywhere in the United Kingdom. A stranger in a bar in Crossmaglen was noticed before the door shut behind him. Merlin Rees, the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, called the place Bandit Country. The soldiers trying to work it covertly were, overwhelmingly, from Yorkshire and Glasgow and the Welsh valleys and the home counties. So, how did it work? The answer isn't what the films tell you. There were no perfect accents. There were almost no cover stories that involved talking to anybody. The unit that did this work had a solution to the accent problem that was architecturally simple, operationally strange, and so physically demanding that most soldiers who volunteered for it failed before they ever got near South Armagh. The solution was, don't be spoken to. The men who did try to talk their way through it, the ones who walked into a bar on their own and started a conversation, we know their names. We know their names because of what happened to them. This channel published a video about this unit before. It described the record, left the method unexplained, and one viewer left a comment asking the obvious question. Building a video around answering it's something this channel intends to keep doing. This is the first. Almost everything on the open record about this unit comes from memoirs and journalism rather than declassified official files. James Rennie's The Operators, Ministry of Defence cleared and published in 1996, and Mark Urban's Big Boys Rules are the closest approximations to primary sourcing, and where their accounts conflict with each other or with other sources, this video says so rather than papering over it. To understand why the unit was built the way it was, you need to understand what it replaced. The British Army arrived in Northern Ireland in 1969. By 1971, it had a covert capability of a kind. The Military Reaction Force, the MRF, was formed in Belfast that summer and improvised. Its method was contact, front companies operating inside nationalist communities, requiring soldiers to physically interact with the people living there. The four-square laundry was the most audacious expression of this. The MRF ran a mobile laundry service into Republican estates in West Belfast, Twinbrook, Andersonstown, collecting clothes and routing them through forensic testing for traces of explosives and gunpowder, while hidden soldiers and cameras occupied a compartment in the van's roof. The Military Intelligence Museum records that female soldiers were used in this operation. For a time, it worked. The IRA had placed double agents inside the MRF. On the morning of the 2nd of October 1972, those agents coordinated attacks on 3 MRF fronts in a single day. At approximately 11:15 in the morning, the four-square laundry van came under sustained fire in Twinbrook. Sapper Edward Stewart, a Royal Engineers soldier working undercover as the driver, was killed. Lance Corporal Sarah Jane Walk, who was at a customer's door at the moment of the attack, survived. The same day, IRA units struck the Gemini Health Studios on Antrim Road and the MRF office at College Square East. In one morning, the covert method that required soldiers to interact directly with the civilian population was burned. The lesson drawn was blunt. An organization built on personal infiltration, operating in a community that had placed its own agents inside it, couldn't survive. Something different was needed, built on observation at distance rather than penetration through presence. Between 1972 and 1974, sources conflict on the exact window. The British Army built its replacement. An April 1974 briefing, prepared for Prime Minister Harold Wilson, describes it as the Special Reconnaissance Unit, then operating under the cover name Northern Ireland Training and Advisory Team. By the early 1980s, the widely used internal designation was 14 Intelligence Company. The people inside it called it the Det. This video uses 14 Intelligence Company as the formal designation and the Det conversationally, as those inside it did. The SAS was central to building the Det, but wasn't the same organisation. Half of 22 SAS's B Squadron was reportedly deployed to close the surveillance gap when the MRF was wound down, while the other half developed selection and training for what became 14 Intelligence Company. SAS officers formed much of the early command staff, and SAS personnel served alongside Det operators throughout the 1970s and 1980s. But the Det recruited across the whole British Armed Forces, Army, Royal Navy, RAF, all ranks, both sexes. Urban reportedly criticised, characterising the Det as an SAS unit. The two organisations overlapped significantly. They weren't the same thing. Structurally, the unit aligned its detachments to British Army brigade areas. There was a main Det at RAF Aldergrove, with detachments at Palace Barracks in Belfast, at Dallykelly in County Londonderry, and in Fermanagh for operations along the southern border. Operator strength is described in various accounts as around 120 at any given time. By the early 1980s, the Det sat within a broader organisation called the Intelligence and Security Group Northern Ireland, which incorporated a dedicated SAS troop alongside it. South Armagh fell under the coverage of the Southern Detachment. Understanding why it was different from everywhere else is necessary for understanding what operating there actually required. South Armagh wasn't difficult in the same way that Belfast was difficult. Belfast was density, alleyways, urban counter-surveillance, rapid movement. South Armagh was something older and more patient. Harnden describes the terrain as hedges like a slumbering giant keeping guard, dense field boundaries, rolling drumlin country that concealed movement in both directions, border ground that gave the IRA's South Armagh Brigade the ability to operate north and withdraw across into the Republic whenever British pressure became untenable. He describes the undulating terrain as combining with a powerful sense of rebellion throughout history to make South Armagh the ideal operating ground for the IRA. The border itself was almost meaningless at ground level. Farm tracks, small roads, fields that crossed it without a sign. A stranger in South Armagh wasn't just noticed. In some townlands, a stranger was treated as a problem until proved otherwise. The area's active service units were, by the mid-1970s, demonstrating what Harnden describes as a counter-surveillance capability that was genuinely advanced, able to identify, adapt to, and preempt British operations with a consistency that conventional infantry had not anticipated. The Drummocaval ambush in November 1975 is the best documented example of what happens when standard infantry fieldcraft is applied in that environment without understanding the social topography. 4 soldiers from the Royal Regiment of Fusiliers walked from Crossmaglen and established an observation post at 2 in the morning on the 21st of November, on a slope behind bushes overlooking a small stream running along the border. At 16:20 the following afternoon, just over 36 hours after they had gone in, up to 12 IRA volunteers attacked from 2 firing positions inside the Republic. James Duncan, aged 19, Peter MacDonald, 19, and Michael Sampson, 20, were killed. Lance Corporal Paul Johnson survived by crawling 25 yards under fire to reach a road, where troops airlifted him to safety. The subsequent Army report on what went wrong is precise and worth reading carefully. The OP had been positioned within sight of several houses. None of the soldiers wore head nets. A ground sheet was flapping in the breeze. Locals had spotted them within hours. Remember, the report stated, in South Armagh it's no use removing local vegetation to provide cover. Locals will soon spot that. That sentence, locals had spotted them, is the operating constraint inside which all British surveillance in South Armagh had to function. The population's detailed generational knowledge of their own countryside meant that any position looking different from what was supposed to be there was a compromised position, sometimes within hours. The Drummer-Caval ambush prompted the formal public deployment of the SAS to South Armagh in 1976, though they had been operating there before that announcement, and the establishment of close observation platoons. Those cops weren't the DT, but they operated on overlapping principles. Small teams trained to go into the ground and stay there, invisible for as long as the target required. That was the landscape the DT was designed to work. What the DT was selecting for is the part of this story the films consistently get wrong. The films imagine a unit selecting people who look Irish, who can do the accent, who can hold a conversation in a Republican pub about Gaelic football without triggering suspicion. The unit was selecting for something close to the opposite. Selection was open to anyone serving in the British Armed Forces, regardless of rank or trade. An Intelligence Corps clerk could apply alongside a parachute regiment corporal. Former member accounts describe a pipeline beginning with a one-day initial program, physical tests, interview, IQ examination, followed by a 2-week selection course and approximately 6 months of specialized training before deployment. In one documented course, described by a former member, of roughly 1,000 applicants, 17 were ultimately deployed to Northern Ireland. That figure is from a single course, not a statistical average, but it has been repeated by people who were there consistently enough to carry weight as an order of magnitude. The criteria documented consistently across multiple accounts include no identifying physical markings, no distinctive tattoos, no scars that would make someone memorable on second glance. The psychological capacity to remain completely still for extended periods, to observe, record, and wait without instruction or reassurance. Excellent observational memory. Independent decision-making under pressure, because when something changes at 2 a.m. in a South Armagh hedgerow, there is no one to call. And running through all of it, a quality that doesn't appear verbatim in any quoted criterion, but that the documented requirements unmistakably describe. The capacity to occupy a space without announcing yourself to it. The unit wasn't building performers, it was building watchers. Peter Taylor states it plainly in Brits. DET operators dressed and behaved like locals while avoiding speech wherever possible. Grunts, not words, were the preferred option. Anything to avoid the sound of a voice that was recognizably not from there. There is a comment sitting under this channel's earlier video about the DET. 3 likes. The commenter insists that women served in this unit and saved men's lives. The commenter is right. 14. Intelligence Company integrated women into covert surveillance roles from its earliest years, almost certainly the first British unit of its type to do so on anything like equal selection terms, more than 4 decades before the formal combat exclusion policy changed in 2016. The reasons weren't principled in any policy sense, they were operational. A man sitting alone in a parked car in Republican South Armagh is conspicuous within minutes. Two men are more conspicuous still. A man and a woman aren't. A 2025 academic study drawing on semi-structured interviews with servicewomen and men who served in the province confirms that male and female operators regularly worked paired together, presenting as couples, because the configuration reduced IRA scrutiny to a fraction of what two men in the same position attracted. A memoir published under the pseudonym She Who Dared, attributed to a female DET operator, describes demanding training and what the author calls nerve-jangling operations in exactly this role. An academic paper examining British servicewomen in Northern Ireland characterises these operators as invisible bodies of war, present, effective and officially unacknowledged. Women weren't in the DET because the British Army was progressive. They were there because they solved a specific operational problem that no amount of accent coaching could touch. The car solved another one. DET operators used ordinary-looking civilian saloon cars as the primary mobile surveillance platform. Ford Sierras, Vauxhall Cavaliers, Renault 5s, unremarkable vehicles in unremarkable colours. Rennie's memoir, cited in secondary analyses, records DET vehicles operating on roads near Crossmaglen, indistinguishable from local civilian traffic. From the outside, just a car. From the inside, the vehicle had been thought about very carefully. Technical modifications documented consistently across multiple independent accounts include Kevlar armour plating built into the bodywork, with deliberately unarmoured gaps positioned to allow operators to fire outward through the panels during anti-ambush drills without opening a door. Concealed radios with hidden speakers and microphones. Cameras fitted throughout the interior. A dashboard brake light cut-off switch, allowing the vehicle to stop for nighttime pickups or drop-offs without the brake lights signalling the manoeuvre to anyone watching from a field. Engine cut-off switches as anti-hijacking measures, bomb tamper detection systems. In some accounts, a foot-triggered flashbang dispenser for breaking through checkpoints. Rennie's account notes that all DET members carried what he calls a car weapon on operations. Operational discipline built around these vehicles mattered as much as the hardware. Routes varied, timings varied, nothing predictable. Operators tailed suspect vehicles through Belfast backstreets and along South Armagh country lanes. One account describes using vehicles as extended observation platforms when no safe house was available, living from the car for days at a stretch. A man in a car does not have to talk to anyone. He does not have to order a drink, respond to a question about where he's from, explain what he's doing parked on a lane near Crossmaglen at 7 in the evening. The vehicle creates a physical barrier between the operator and the civilian world around it. Taylor states it explicitly in Brits. Wherever possible, DET operators avoided opening their mouths. Grunts, not words. A grunt is a sound. A sentence is an accent. That is the answer to the question, not a trick with vowel sounds. An institutional decision made in the mid-1970s to build a surveillance unit whose entire operational posture was designed so that the accent question never needed to arise. The car handled the mobile surveillance problem. The hide handled everything else. Read the Drummock-Oval after-action report in reverse, not as a description of failure, but as a specification of what success required. An observation post that can't be seen from nearby houses. Operators who don't disturb local vegetation, who don't move in daylight, who look like nothing but empty hillside. A hide that for the duration of its occupation is simply not there. The MOD's 2006 analysis of Operation Banner, released inadvertently, widely cited for years before being quietly withdrawn from formal circulation, confirms static observation posts occupied for days at a time as standard British practice throughout the campaign. The Drumackerval ambush didn't create the concept of the static OP. It defined what getting it right required. A former operator, quoted in multiple essays drawing on first-hand testimony, describes the physical reality plainly. In South Armagh, they averaged 11 days at a time in a static observation post. Cold rations, urinating into a bottle, defecating into cling film, wrapping it up, carrying it out on extraction. The 11-day figure is from one first-hand account, not a confirmed standard duration. But the waste management principle it describes, that nothing can leave a trace of human presence, is confirmed independently, including by a detailed account from an ammunition technical officer who occupied an attic OP and describes a support team arriving under cover of darkness to remove refuse, replace supplies, and leave no sign of the visit. Picture what this actually involves. 2 operators, typically, inserted at night. The hide prepared under cover of darkness, a hedgerow, a ditch, a derelict roof space, wherever a clear sightline to the target exists. The entry point planned. The exit route mapped across ground that provides cover regardless of direction. Once daylight comes, neither operator moves above the vegetation line. No standing, no sitting upright, nothing that breaks the outline of the hedge or the turf above them. One observing, one covering, rotating in silence on an agreed pattern. No cooking. The smell carries further than vision in still air. No light of any kind, no cigarettes, nothing that produces a flicker visible at field range. Sleep in rotation, so one operator is always watching. And everything that enters, every food wrapper, every empty bottle, every piece of human waste, leaves again on extraction. The waste management detail isn't a minor operational inconvenience. It's the measure of how completely the occupation has to be invisible. A used food wrapper blowing out of a hedge on the 3rd day can compromise a position maintained correctly for 2. Everything goes in, everything comes out. The hedge must look exactly as it looked before anyone entered it. There are comments sitting under several videos on this channel that describe exactly the moment when this discipline was nearly seen. 4 commenters, 198 likes between them, all describing the same thing. A man felling trees and soldiers appearing from the ground before the tree could fall. A man walking a hillside and 2 figures rising from what he had taken to be turf. Shepherds who turned out not to be shepherds. Cadets waking on exercise with stickers on their heads they hadn't had when they fell asleep. Several of these almost certainly describe SAS or other units training in Great Britain rather than DET operations in South Armagh specifically. The terrain and circumstances in multiple accounts point at exercises elsewhere in the British Isles. But they describe something documented and real. What a functioning covert observation post looks like from outside, on the rare occasion when someone gets close enough to nearly see it. The ground opens and produces a soldier, then it closes again. That is the discipline working. Undisturbed countryside because it has been treated as undisturbed countryside from the moment the team inserted the night before. The people who left those comments saw the one moment in 100 when near failure was briefly visible from the outside. 50 yards further back, and they'd have walked home seeing nothing at all. In the same years the DET was operating from cars and from long-duration rural hides, a British Army officer working in South Armagh was doing something different. Captain Robert Nairac of the Grenadier Guards served 4 tours in Northern Ireland, totalling approximately 28 months. His formal role on his second tour, 1974 to 1975, was as liaison officer for 4 Field Survey Troop Royal Engineers, one of the 3 sub-units of 14 Intelligence Company, working between the unit, the local British Army Brigade, and the RUC Special Branch. His formal role on his 4th and final tour was as Military Intelligence Liaison Officer at Bessbrook Mill. He wasn't a standard det surveillance operator. He wasn't an SAS member. His name does not appear on SAS memorials. Ken Connor, who was involved in creating 14 Intelligence Company, wrote in Ghost Force that had Nairac been an SAS member, he wouldn't have been permitted to operate as he did. Before his death, Connor wrote, there had been considerable concern about the lack of checks on his activities. No one seemed certain who his commanding officer was. He appeared to have been deciding for himself which tasks he would undertake. On the evening of 14th May 1977, Nairac left Bessbrook Mill alone at 9:25 p.m. He drove to the 3 Steps Inn at Drominty, a village in South Armagh. Witness accounts describe him using the name Danny McAlevey in the pub, a motor mechanic from Ardoyne, and singing a Republican song with the band playing that night. Neither the persona nor the singing appear in the trial record itself. The popular version of the evening holds that a practiced Irish accent failed him, that what followed was the direct consequence of a voice that wasn't convincing enough. That specific version isn't corroborated by any judicial proceedings. What is established by trial records and subsequent convictions is the sequence. Sometime after 11 o'clock, he was walked out of the pub by several men. In the car park, a struggle, a metallic sound from his person. He was overpowered, driven across the border to Ravensdale Woods in County Louth, beaten, interrogated, and shot dead. His body has never been found. Liam Townsend was convicted of his murder by the Special Criminal Court in Dublin on the 8th November 1977, given a life sentence. Nairac was posthumously awarded the George Cross in February 1979. Whether his cover was compromised because of his accent, because he was already known in the area from previous operations, because of IRA counterintelligence, or because of something else entirely, isn't established by the available evidence. The trial record documents the outcome. It doesn't resolve that question. What this video has been building toward is structural rather than biographical. Nairac isn't remembered as the det's finest practitioner. He is remembered because he did the thing the unit's entire method was designed to prevent. He went alone to a hostile civilian space at night, without a support element capable of reaching him in time, and relied on a cover that depended entirely on being addressed by strangers and not identified. The operators who followed the doctrine aren't remembered. They were never seen. There is a final layer to the popular picture that needs correcting, and it's the most important one. The popular image of intelligence work in Northern Ireland imagines British soldiers passing as Irish civilians. The perfect accent, the convincing backstory, the penetration of the IRA from the inside. The det corrects part of that picture. The actual method was distance and avoidance, not personal infiltration. But even the det's work, the cars, the hides, the long-duration OPs, accounted for a comparatively small share of the overall intelligence effort. Academic analysis of intelligence sources during the Troubles suggests that roughly 60% of actionable intelligence came from human sources. Agents and informers inside Republican communities providing information to British intelligence. Technical means, electronic intercepts and surveillance equipment accounted for approximately 20%. Static and mobile surveillance, of the kind the det conducted, was responsible for around 15%. The majority of the intelligence that disrupted IRA operations didn't come from Englishmen passing as Irishmen. It came from Irish people, recruited and handled by British intelligence officers who were never anywhere near the target themselves. The Force Research Unit, established around 1980 to 1982, centralised agent recruitment and handling for the British Army in Northern Ireland. Its function, as described in multiple accounts, including Nick Davis's 1033, was to obtain intelligence by secretly penetrating terrorist organisations, recruiting and running agents inside them. The handler was never near the target. That was the point. The agent absorbed the risk. The handler ran the relationship from a remove, through a structure designed to keep both parties invisible and alive. Taylor describes informants as the lifeblood of intelligence in the province. The DET's surveillance capability mattered. The human source network was what most decisions were built on. The Good Listener podcast has published 2 interviews directly relevant to this, one with Mick Hawkes, a former DET surveillance operator, and one with a former FRU handler who ran agents in South Armagh. The FRU handler interview is one of the most detailed first-person accounts of what agent recruitment and running actually looked like from inside the relationship, available in any open-source format. Both are linked in the description. So the answer to the question nobody replied to is a disappointment, and then it isn't. They didn't have perfect accents. Most of them never opened their mouths at all. The whole architecture, the cars, the hides, the timings, the sources, was built around a single operating principle. The safest thing an English soldier could do in South Armagh was to never be in a position where an Irish person needed to speak to him. Then you look at what that principle actually cost. Not a clever line in a bar. 11 days lying on your side in a hedgerow in November in Armagh, not moving, managing everything that comes with 11 days in a field, carrying everything out when you finally go. The stories in the comments are all the same story. Somebody was doing something ordinary, felling a tree, walking a hill, and the ground opened up and produced a man, and then it closed again. That isn't folklore. That is the one time in 1,000 when the doctrine was nearly seen from the outside. The other 999 times, nobody saw anything at all. If you ever saw one, put it below. The year and the county.